Sirens scream. British sailors run across the aircraft carrier deck. Japanese kamikaze planes are inbound. Anti-aircraft guns fire into the sky. Planes are launched from the deck. Sailors dive for cover. An enemy plane goes down, then another, and another. The sky is filled with explosions, but out of the smoke comes a horrible sight. One of the kamikaze pilots has made it through. The plane dives. The bombs on the underside of the aircraft reflect the gleam of sunlight. The kamikaze slams into the aircraft carrier's deck. There is a huge explosion. Fire streams across the runway. Sailors sprint with hoses to put out the flames. When they are under control, the mechanics and engineers look over the ship. It is relatively unscathed. With a few quick repairs, the carrier is once again ready for battle. Nothing is going to stop the British Pacific Fleet, not even Japan's most deadly kamikaze pilots. This was the reality of naval warfare in 1945. The British Pacific Fleet had come to fight alongside the Americans in the Pacific, and their ships were proving to be almost invincible. But why? What made British carriers so resistant to kamikaze attacks? The answer was one word: armor. The concept of the armored aircraft carrier was the brainchild of a forgotten naval genius, Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson. He was a man ahead of his time. In the 1930s, while other navies were building carriers with wooden flight decks, Henderson argued that the flight deck itself should be armored. He believed that carriers would be prime targets for enemy bombers. He believed they needed to survive direct hits. Henderson's vision was controversial. Armor was heavy. It would reduce the number of aircraft a carrier could carry. The Royal Navy's carriers would have smaller air groups than their American counterparts. But Henderson was adamant. He argued that a carrier that could survive a hit was more valuable than a carrier that could carry more planes but would be destroyed by a single bomb. His vision was proven right. The first armored carriers, the illustrious class, were laid down in 1937. They had 4.5 inches of armored steel on their flight decks, extending down to the hangar sides. Below that, a second layer of thinner armor protected the ship's vitals. These carriers could carry only 36 aircraft, compared to over 90 on an American Essex-class carrier. But they could survive attacks that would destroy their American counterparts. The British Pacific Fleet was born out of necessity and politics. After the devastating loss of the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in December 1941, the Royal Navy had been driven out of the Pacific. For 3 years, the Americans fought the war against Japan almost alone. But by 1944, it was clear that the British needed to return. There were political reasons. Britain had to be seen as a contributor to the defeat of Japan to maintain its influence in the post-war world. There were military reasons. The Allies were closing in on Japan from all sides. And there were practical reasons. The Royal Navy needed to learn how to operate in the Pacific. The Admiralty proposed an active role in the Pacific in early 1944. But the initial response from the U.S. Navy was discouraging. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, was reluctant. He demanded that the British Pacific Fleet be entirely self-sufficient. President Franklin Roosevelt overruled him. The British fleet was accepted. The British Pacific Fleet was formally established on November 22, 1944, under Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser. The fleet was massive. It included 4 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, 15 smaller carriers, over 750 aircraft, 11 cruisers, and many smaller warships and support vessels. It was the most powerful conventional fleet ever assembled by the Royal Navy. It set up its main base in Sydney, Australia, with a forward base at Manus Island. The logistical challenges were enormous, but the Americans provided support, and the fleet was ready to fight. The British Pacific Fleet's first major operation was against the oil refineries at Palembang in Sumatra. The mission was to destroy Japan's oil supplies. It was also a test. Admiral Nimitz wanted to see what the British could do. They did not disappoint. On January 24, 1945, the fleet attacked the refinery at Plagio. They destroyed it. 5 days later, they attacked the second target at Soengi-Garong. They destroyed that too. The missions were a success. They had dealt a blow to Japan's war machine, but the real test was yet to come. The fleet was assigned to Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. The British fleet's task was to neutralize the Japanese airfields on the Sakishima Islands. These were the islands where the Japanese launched their kamikaze attacks against the American fleet. The British were given a vital role. They were to act as a flexible reserve, capable of responding to any threat. They were also to stop any Japanese aircraft from reaching the Americans. The British Pacific Fleet was now designated Task Force 57. It was a formidable force, but it was about to face the most dangerous threat in the Pacific. The kamikaze was Japan's deadliest weapon. A pilot would fly his plane directly into an enemy ship. The pilot would die, but the ship might be destroyed. The Americans had suffered devastating losses from kamikazes. Hundreds of ships had been damaged. Many had been sunk. The American carriers, with their wooden flight decks, were especially vulnerable. A kamikaze could punch a hole straight through the deck, igniting the fuel and ammunition below. The damage could be catastrophic. But the British carriers were different. Their armored flight decks were designed to withstand direct hits. They could take the impact of a kamikaze and remain in action. The difference was so profound that it caught the attention of the American press. A contemporary newspaper article noted that the British carriers in the Pacific have decks made of rather thick armor, whereas the American carriers in the Pacific have wooden flight decks. The article reported that 3 British carriers have been hit by suicide planes, which caused considerable fires on the flight deck, but the flames did not reach the hangar decks, and the damage was considerably less than that suffered by some American Essex-class carriers. The difference was not just a matter of opinion, it was a matter of physics. The armored deck was not just a defense against bombs, it was a defense against the kamikaze's kinetic energy. The impact of a suicide plane could be absorbed and dissipated by the armor. The American wooden deck would simply be destroyed. The British carriers were, in effect, invincible. The British carriers were not just defended by their armor. They were also defended by their pilots and planes. The Fleet Air Arm had some of the most experienced pilots in the world. They were flying a mix of American-built Corsairs and British-built Avengers. They were well-trained and well-led. But it was the armor that made the difference. At Okinawa, the British fleet was under constant attack. The kamikazes came in waves. They were determined to sink the British ships. They would fail. The first British aircraft carrier to be hit was HMS Indefatigable. The kamikaze broke through the fleet's defenses and crashed directly into the flight deck. The impact was huge. The plane smashed into the deck, causing a massive fire. It seemed like the ship was doomed, but within hours the Indefatigable was launching aircraft again. Admiral Sir Philip Vian, who commanded the carriers, later said, "The armored flight deck, which was a feature of British fleet carriers, paid a dividend on this occasion." In spite of the direct hit, Indefatigable was able to operate aircraft again within a few hours. American carriers similarly struck were invariably forced to return to a fully equipped Navy yard for repairs. The Indefatigable was just the beginning. Every single one of the British aircraft carriers would be hit by kamikazes. Every single one would survive. The Formidable was struck by a kamikaze that also dropped a 500-pound bomb on the deck. It put a 2-foot hole in the flight deck, but the crew repaired it, and flights resumed later that day. The Victorious was struck by multiple kamikazes. One smashed into the flight deck and knocked out the carrier's catapult. Another bounced off the aft deck and into the ocean. The damage was superficial. The British Pacific Fleet had proven itself. It was invincible. The difference between the British and American designs was not just about armor. It was also about philosophy. The Americans had designed their carriers to carry as many planes as possible. They believed that the best defense was a good offense. The British had designed their carriers to be resilient. They believed that a carrier that could survive a hit was more valuable than a carrier that could carry more planes but would be destroyed. The result was that the British carriers were slower and carried fewer planes, but they were also much more durable. Admiral Vian summarized it perfectly when he said, "The British carriers, with their armored decks, higher safety precautions and closed hangars, could stow fewer aircraft than their American counterparts." On the other hand, events were to show that had our carriers not had armored decks, Task Force 57 would have been reduced to negligible proportions. In other words, if the British carriers had not been armored, the British Pacific Fleet would have been destroyed. The armor was the one reason they were invincible. The legacy of the British Pacific Fleet is one of resilience and innovation. The armored aircraft carrier was a British invention. It was a design that would be copied by other navies in the post-war era. The concept of the armored flight deck was a direct result of the experiences of the Royal Navy in the Second World War. But the true heroes were the men who sailed on those carriers, the pilots who launched from the decks, the sailors who fought the fires, and the crews who repaired the ships. They were the ones who proved that the British Pacific Fleet could withstand anything the Japanese could throw at them. Without the support of the British Pacific Fleet, the war in the Pacific may have lasted much longer. The armored flight deck was not just a piece of steel, it was a symbol of British determination and resilience. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And let us know in the comments, do you think the British carriers were truly invincible?